I believe that MTX Mototrax is the greatest motocross console video game we've seen.
Under drinking age, a 2-litre bottle of Pepsi and some Doritos.
Over drinking age.
MX vs ATV Reflex, all-time game.
And then we get to Alive and I'm just like, what is this?
3, 2, 1. Hello all.
We're back.
Bench Racers on the Ride Network.
Episode 2.
Jared English.
Kane Taylor.
And we're here today to discuss a topic very near and dear to our hearts and probably that of especially motocross and enduro supercross riders. That is Motocross and Supercross video games.
The GOAT, which is it?
It's a topic that is up for hot debate.
It's something that's close to me, the console games, because it did characterize it's my upbringing, basically. And you got to think these video games are sort of in that pre-digital age, pre-smartphone. So it was sort of like you'd get to a track, you'd go to a race, and there was one person there at least that you knew in the back of their van. They had a screen, they had a PS2, Xbox, whatever it was, and there was some MX ATV or like whatever was going on. So for me, it's a big part of my childhood. I think we need to preface that there is a massive community of, MX Simulator and that sort of world, which is huge. But we're sort of talking more about the console side of things in this episode, I would say. But we're going to get into it. Which one's the greatest of all time? I want to hear yours.
It's somewhat of a cop-out, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on it. But I feel like for a lot of people, the greatest Moto video game is the one that they were best at. So for me, I totally understand the narrative around Reflex, MX vs ATV Reflex, all-time game. For me, I think, this is a horrible take, but I think it's maybe MX 2002 or MX Superfly.
No.
They are not the greatest games around, but when you can beat your friends almost every time on a video game, I'm not sure how it can't be your favorite. I think that plays into it.
Okay, when you say beating friends, you're really putting the personal challenge on me, because little do people know we played this 2 days ago. We searched pretty much all the games.
Yeah.
And you did win all the races on the 2002 and the Superfly. You're pretty handy at both of them. But they were great games. Specifically Superfly for me because, while the physics are wild now, like the physics are wild to play.
Unbelievable.
The dudes don't sit down. They don't put their foot out when they turn. They sort of just stand and like tip the bikes over. And it's pretty unstable to play. But when I think about a video game, and this is why like Reflex is fantastic, and it revolutionized the gaming space for us, I believe. The dual analog stick, the leaning, the saves, the catching, the whips, like all the stuff collectively you could do was fantastic. But there's more to a video game than just the physics. And Reflex nailed the physics like they did. That's, for me, from a console perspective, that's the best physics we've seen on a video game. But, I look at it more holistically, and it's like with Superfly, okay, the physics were real dodgy, but the soundtrack was rad and the environments were rad. And there was so many really cool elements to it. The riders were cool. And it's the same story for a lot of those games in that period of time, because for whatever reason, song licensing seemed to be more accessible. You could get more tracks. So you'd see like Body Jar and Slipknot and Pennywise and all these like rad tunes were all a part of it. But then when you get to Reflex, it sort of lacks that, I guess, cultural relevance. And so like I'm going to piggyback off what you say. And my favorite video game of all time and what I consider to be the GOAT, and this will be very hotly debated, I believe, was MTX Mototrax. And MTX Mototrax was super cool because it was part of that Activision ecosphere at that time. So you play it and it's very, very similar to what you would find as a part of like a Tony Hawk's franchise or a Matt Hoffman's franchise, or, those franchises when Activision did invest $10 million at that time into that extreme sports space to really facilitate great video games. And for me, it was MTX Mototrax for largely similar reasons why I'm sure you'd pick 2002 or Superfly.
Probably there's a whole decade of games, I'd say, that they were more than just games. They're an extension of, I think, that lifestyle element that X Games and the like brought to not only the real physical motorcycling world, but video games. I just think that they had such a significant impact on the culture of things. Whilst maybe the quality could be conceived to have, improved over time, I think that, do they have the same feel? I'm not sure. Am I just an old man? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't think they do. I think we've moved away from that. And I think that, like, I seshed Reflex hard, really hard, but it did lack that cultural element that I think some of the earlier games had. MTX, it was very similar to, once again, I go back to the Tony Hawk's franchise where, you would interact with Travis Pastrana and you would interact with Cowboy Kenny and Nate Adams and these characters in the game roaming an environment. You go right up to them and you chat to them. So for me, it's what characterizes a good video game. Holistically, once again, it's not just related to sort of the physics. Though it was very weak, like it had a bit of a narrative story too, where you were like a bit of an up-and-comer. The first environment you go to is TP's house. He kind of teaches you how to ride and you get to explore his house, which was awesome, and to have those characters there. I mean, Tommy Clowes took so many great characters that you'd go interface with, just like in Tony Hawk's. You'd go speak to Tony or you'd go speak to Bam or you'd go speak to Jamie Thomas or whoever it was. It just added that element of story and culture, which I think that a lot of the other video games that came after it lacked.
Motocross and Supercross can sometimes be a hard sell to the mainstream. But I think what MTX Mototrax really did well was take a narrative, albeit incredibly basic, and just allow people to get a window into the world of some of these athletes. It felt like access, I guess you'd say. It's an access that you didn't have in everyday life. Back then we had DVDs, seeing some of these athletes was sporadic at best. There's no YouTube. You didn't have access to these people day in and day out. And so the ability to jump in there and feel like in some way you were interacting with TP, with Travis Pastrana, was like otherworldly when you're like a kid or a teenager at that point in time. It's just, it added a whole new element. And I'm not entirely sure. I don't really see that it's been bested to date on that front, especially when you take into context the likes of like an NBA 2K franchise and the way that they've riffed and played on characters over the years and character development, both with the stars of the sport and you as the character that you play. I think that, I can understand how Mototrax was attractive to you.
Yeah, and it's so basic though. Like, it's not like a whole heap of thought went into it, I don't believe. It's the simple fact that, once again, you would interface with those guys, and as your skill level increased, you would go to different areas and learn new tricks from, once again, Tommy Clowes, Nate Adams. But on the racing side too, it wasn't just simply, you win races and out of nowhere you unlock stuff. Like, you'd have an email database, and like you'd just receive an email in your inbox from Yamaha. And it's so basic, but it just allows a little bit more immersion into the story rather than just winning a race and just receiving some gear for who knows what reason, like you won, cool. Yeah, I look to those games just more from a cultural perspective, and same with Superfly and same with a lot of those games from around that period, especially soundtrack. Like, it all just adds to that holistic experience. But, when we get to the MX vs. ATV franchise, particularly MX Unleashed, that's where we get a taste of physics and the ability to do different rhythm lanes and to preload and to do, all of this crazy stuff that we didn't necessarily have the ability to do beforehand. And I think that a hallmark game in that time was MX vs. ATV Unleashed.
First and foremost, the gameplay itself went in leaps and bounds. When it starts to become a matter of inches between you and your brother or you and your mates, now we look back on it, it's a long way away from it. But at the time, it was that little bit closer to the real life racing experience, the intensity, the closeness, and anybody who's raced motocross would understand that level of intensity. And it's crazy that they took that and gave it to, teenagers around the world in even just a slither of that intensity.
For me, that was very revolutionary. And then, the story goes on with MX vs ATV to get to Untamed and then get to Reflex, which obviously changed the game massively once again. But, the physics on Reflex just haven't been rivaled since.
No. And probably more so if you're someone who grew up in the generation of video games. You don't have to spend too long on the internet to find opinions on both MX vs ATV, Reflex, and the games that came after. For me, I'd say the core thing about that game, about Reflex, was the skill gap. I think the enhanced physics,
track deg,
I think that those kinds of things sort of add up to a game where I would like to believe, maybe it's delusional, but I'd like to believe a moto rider, first time they hit the track in that game, if they're facing off against someone who's never ridden a motorbike, there will be a difference in the results, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, it's not unrealistic and unreasonable to say that Reflex changed the game. Pardon the pun, but it did. It was a revolutionary game in terms of the physics that it introduced. Once again, like the dual analog stick, so you could move the rider, move the bike. Even like the little things like go or accelerator was R2. The R2, L2 sort of thing, as opposed to X and square. But yeah, that was a game where I think everybody clocked up so many miles, and you could pick a lot of tracks out of that game, like Fort Dodge, Parai Valley. Like, some are really like the greatest and most iconic tracks. Iconic tracks across the board in terms of all the games. But it's tough to know. It's tough to know exactly what made that game so special, because it was. And I think it probably extends a bit more past the physics. What's more interesting when it comes to Reflex is that's widely considered as, the best physics. And once again, I think that what we wanted as a community was just update it. Just update it, give us some more tracks, give us some more riders, more skins, maybe tweak the physics just a little bit. But that's all we wanted, just to change it up a little bit. And the story is quite complex, and I believe that I'm getting it right, but the code, with a THQ Nordic kind of situation, was thrown away, gone, deleted. And then you get Alive after that, which was sort of like a recreation of the code, and you could see the similarities, but it just wasn't the same.
No, it's ironic, but I think because so many people thought that Alive was a backward step, I doubled down on spending time in it so I could beat my mates. And, I think it was a lot harder to beat people in Reflex because the community as a whole was so strong. When you start to think about advancement on that platform as it pertains to other games, it was relatively slow for a long time. But that particular game seemed to, win people over. They struck gold, I guess, with the physics of that game. MX vs ATV Reflex almost was the pinnacle for a lot of people of a series of games that they'd followed in the same capacity that they'd follow a television series or a series of movies, and it seemed to just hit its apex just the same as kind of any other medium.
The difference between MX Unleashed to MX vs ATV Unleashed, okay, that was a clear step up, a building block upon what MX Unleashed was. Because MX Unleashed was great too. I really liked that game, but there were certain things that when it became MX vs ATV, they really cleaned up. But then, when you get to Untamed, which you got two different versions of Untamed, which was strange in a way because they built one for PS2, one for PS3, and they weren't the same game. They were two very different games. I would consider, that Untamed series or title at that time as a step backwards. For me, it wasn't sequential. It was sort of like, okay, good, down a bit, and then Reflex came and it was like, wow, this thing's crazy. Like, this thing's amazing. And then we get to Alive and I'm just like, what is this? Like, for me personally, it was just like, what is this? Because I think for us as a community, we were just expecting, Reflex 2.0, like the same physics, just to get a bit better. And it'd be like, this would be sick when it comes out. And I just remember the hype. It's tangible, it's palpable for me. And then you put in Alive And for me, it was just so heartbreaking to get that game. And I respect what they did. You know, they really tried to recreate it, and there were elements of it that were close, but like the momentum wasn't right. You really had to get things pinpoint accurate, which is cool in a way, but like, you know, in the real world, if you clip a rhythm section, you don't come to a dead stop. Like, you got to case it pretty bad to come to a dead stop. Like, that's just not how it worked. So the physics on that game just weren't quite realistic. And once again, coming from Reflex, which was such a monumental stepping stone in our community, in our industry, was just, for me, just so disappointing.
We've got MX versus ATV Reflex. We're arguing that has probably the strongest physics of any game. And I don't think we're just arguing that point. I think it's supported by a lot of people on the internet. So you could argue that that's sort of case closed from that perspective. We've got MTX Mototrax. I wouldn't say that was necessarily an incredible narrative, but it had a narrative. But since this time, since Reflex, it just seems like, and I have to say, with all due respect to the people developing this game, I don't envy them. You know, this is a hardcore audience that are really looking for something specific. But you've got the story elements clearly struck a chord with a lot of people, you and I included. You've got the physics, which was just absolutely dialed at one point in time, a long time ago now.
Yeah. I mean, what was it? 2011, 2013, something? It's essentially a decade.
What are people looking for now? Are they looking for an amalgamation, you know, a coming together of those two things? I mean, I think across every other gaming genre, that is typically what people are looking for. I know that's what I'm looking for. I mean, I'm a relatively casual gamer, but if you can give me a good story and some good gameplay, you know, I'm going to end up not paying attention to the rest of my life for a couple of days. So, like, what is it that has to be done? We've seen the Supercross series come through. I think, you know, there's elements of that are really cool. I think being able to kind of, you know, put yourself in the shoes or the boots, so to speak, of Supercross athletes and ride sort of replicas of these real tracks has some cool elements. MX vs ATV has kind of continued to do their thing, albeit not perhaps having access to that same physics engine, and they do some things really well. But it feels a little bit like motocross / supercross, and I guess ATV, buggy, whatever you want to call it, games now, but largely motocross and supercross games. They've kind of hit a point where I'm not sure you could confidently say they're progressing in terms of how much they're providing satisfaction to the players.
We're probably a little lost. Like, we're probably a little lost in terms of actually, you know, what we're really trying to accomplish. It's like, yeah, we make fun motocross, supercross, ATV, buggy games. And you also ask, like, what are people looking for? And there's a lot of people who have found what they're looking for, and they're out there, and it's the PC guys who play, you know, MX Sim and that kind of thing. And I know you're out there because you're going to call me a casual, and call me a casual all you want, because I agree, I don't play those ones. I've seen them, I've seen the leagues, and that stuff's sick. But once again, like, yeah, I just think we're a little bit lost. And like, MX vs ATV is doing their best. They're obviously continuing to publish certain things, and we've had a cool time on All Out. You know, we've had some good battles on that, and you don't necessarily know like where you're positioned with those games. Like, we sort of say we like them because we get to battle, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we like them. You know what I mean? So I don't know where that position is, because I don't think I would say that I particularly like the game, but it's fun to get on it and just battle with your friends. So there's sort of like two distinctions to make there.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, let's be honest. I think if you get together with your friends under drinking age and you've got like a 2-liter bottle of Pepsi and some Doritos and you're hanging out, having a sweet time, you can have...
Over drinking age, that's still a kick-ass.
And honestly, like, I envy kids out there drinking 2 liters worth of Pepsi and eating Doritos, and my body doesn't handle that anymore. But if you're out there and you're doing that and you're playing these video games, and as long as the battle's tight, it's probably like anything else. It's going to be fun.
Yeah.
But I guess the point of this discussion is to talk about, you know, what makes a great game?
I think it's the amalgamation of the two things. What I would really like to see is a sort of in-depth narrative story element that is authentic to our sport. And we see it in different areas of our sport, but like when someone tries to come in who doesn't really know anything about the sport and create a narrative, it just doesn't work. Like they don't really get it and they don't really understand it. So it's got to be people who do understand the sport to get the story right. And the story right is the story. It's like a kid growing up wanting to make the big leagues, going through the trials and tribulations to get there. I think it is an amalgamation, because what you want to do is you want to feel some sort of way towards the character. You want to see them largely succeed because it is the protagonist and you are the character. But you also want a really cool like physics system with it. Like, so it's two things there. That's what I think people are looking for. That's what I know that I'm looking for. And, we're yet to see it, because once again, with these modern games that we get, like, okay, you've got Supercross and you've got MXGP, and I know the marketing's like, be a champion and become the champion and race the best and win the championship. But it's like, well, who am I? Like, who's my dude?
What are the stakes as well?
What are the stakes? Where'd I come from? Like, I'm just some random dude that's shown up out of nowhere. I don't know who I am in relation to everybody else. You know what I mean? Like, I would just like to see, and like you said with NBA, like they'll create some character pre-draft, like, and there'll be a story about it. And like, yeah, then you'll get into the seasons and there'll be no more story. But at least you have some understanding of who you are. With these other games that we get, you have no idea. Sure, you start in the littler leagues, but it's like, it's just like we've seen it, like it's already been done kind of thing.
I think the interesting parallel, so you're talking about NBA games. The interesting thing is NBA have almost capitalized already on the global audience. Motocross, Supercross is a very small sport by comparison. And so there's a lot of room for growth. And so in the NBA 2K franchise, where maybe they're starting to move away from those storytelling elements because people are so well versed with the sport that they just want to get in and play games. They want to play a season of games. They want to jump in. They want to play online. With Motocross or Supercross games, there is a lot of room for attracting a new audience. And so those storytelling elements, I think, are a lot more important. And sure, I guarantee that, there's probably 20, 30-year-olds out there who are going to jump into the game and, a really well-constructed narrative might feel a little bit boring. Yeah, okay, I know that I'm an amateur and I'm going to go on to become a pro. But I think for someone who's new to the sport, it gives them such a great idea of what it's all about the trials and tribulations, about what it takes. It gives them some elements to hang on to in terms of what are people going through? What are these athletes going through to become a Supercross champion? So then when you're on the track and you're racing your mates, if you're not someone who's been exposed to that for years and years and years, you just get a better idea of what the sport is all about, which I think is something that's severely lacking from these games.
Yeah, I think it's got to be like that. And I think, circling back to, what we consider to be the best games, and like, I know I'm going to say it and I'm probably going to get lit up in the comments, like I said earlier, but I believe that MTX Mototrax is the greatest motocross console video game we've seen. And I'll say it to the camera, that's what I believe. But and I believe that because of those storytelling elements that we have and just everything that went along with it. Like, it felt like it was more than just a motocross supercross game. Like, we were in harmony with skateboarding, we were in harmony with snowboarding, we were in harmony with X Games and that whole action sports ecosystem. And I know that early 2000s era was a really strong time for our sport. It really aligned with, skateboarding and that kind of thing. It was more action sports was going through a brilliant time in the market. The different environments that you would go to and the emailing system that would let you know that you're a part of Oakley, or you're a part of Smith, or you're a part of Fox, or you're a part of Thor. Like, there was some sort of element there where it's like, well, this is my character. Like, this is who I am. This is who I'm playing as. And these are the people that I'm interacting with, like Cowboy Kenny, like Tommy Clowers, and so that's why I believe Mototrax is the best game ever that we've seen, and special shout out for me for Reflex for that physics engine, because I think it was unbelievable and it represented such a big moment in our sport. But I'm sticking with Mototrax.
Fair enough.
Mototrax didn't have ATVs, so you would have felt like you were severely lacking an element of your UTV buggy racing career.
It's true. Yeah. For context, the reason why we joke is after the best part of, I guess, over 2 decades of playing these games in one way, shape, or form, I actually recently was forced by this guy to race ATVs in-game for the first time ever. So, look, on that note, you're calling out MTX Mototrax as your favorite game. I totally understand why. For me, it probably harkens back to Superfly 2002, and I think that's purely objectively because that's just the ones that I'm best at.
You showed at those.
Well, I'm just going to claim it. But I'm saying Reflex, it's still the benchmark in terms of physics. Mototrax, it's got the story elements. I'm interested to hear from you guys, the audience, where do games go from here? Do we find a way to get both of those things together? What does that look like? It doesn't seem like too tall a ask, with full respect to the people who are developing these games and working their butts off to make it happen. But I don't know, not only will you feed the current generation of motorcycle gamers, but I think you could inspire a whole new generation of not only motorcycle gamers, but motorcycle riders.
I'm just waiting for people to just light me up saying I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm a casual gamer.
We don't.
And, I don't know. I have no idea. But and that I didn't choose Reflex, so let me have it, I guess.
Yeah. So let Kane have it and let us know what your favorite game is. But don't just let us know what your favorite game is. Let us know why. What makes a great game? Where do we go from here? Motocross video games are awesome, but I think they can get a lot better. So I guess from Kane, from myself, we're on the Ride Network. We're Bench Racers. We'll see you next time.
Catch you next time.